Hello there, and welcome back to Ears to the East, where we're going to do something rather interesting for you Band-Maid fans. See, not so long ago, we did a video where we were talking about the debut Baby Metal album that came out in 2014, and of course made huge waves, changing so much of what we know about Japanese music and its effect overseas. But at the same time, in the same year, a little debut album by Band-Maid came out,
It
and
was actually the same
admittedly,
year. Didn't even know.
yeah, 2014. But the thing is that Band-Maid went very much in a different direction, with very much of a quiet start and slowly building up like a snowball effect, getting bigger and bigger over the years. So we're here to talk about that first album, the slightly controversial, maybe, and the very divisive album, Made in Japan. Thank you for holding up that. I love that, holding up that cover, which
Yeah,
basically
it's
is just
mostly white, so it's hard to
yeah,
see anything.
that's the reissue cover, just so everyone knows.
Yeah.
The reissue just has a white cover, but it's got a nice little embossed thing on it, which you can see in the right lighting. So it's
Yeah,
all
yeah, yes, you can.
just tilt it a bit. Maybe we can see it. Maybe we can see it. No, we
You
can't
Oh,
see
there
it.
we
Oh,
go.
well, we
We
can
can
see
see it. There we go. We
it.
can see a little bit now.
All right, so yeah, Made in Japan. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm assuming if you're watching this, you've probably heard it before, but it's obviously back from their first few albums where they were not primarily the songwriters of their own music, where they were very much, it was in a pre-Frill point where they were still unsure about what they wanted to be as a band, before they'd sort of found that that strong anchor that came after the song Thrill came out.
Was
And it's
actually maybe you know about this, but because I
okay.
always hear that. But was it really that they didn't know what they wanted to do, or was it more that they were constricted by them having to conform to their label?
Well, this is one of those ones where I'm glad you brought that up because I'm sure lots of people have opinions on that. And
Privy
I am
time.
going to jump in
Privy time.
straight away and say, I don't think that anyone realistically knows. It's one of those things where even if someone who was there said, oh, it was like this, I can just imagine people would probably have different opinions on it. Maybe if you ask several people who were there from the company, from the band, they might all have
It
different
might be
opinions
both.
on why. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say that as far as I know, I don't think anyone knows, but moreover, I mean, let's face it, they were new. They'd come from very different projects, very different background. Miku was still trying to work out what she wanted to do. She just brought in Psyche to become the singer. You got the Mochi Torchis crowd in there as well with Akane and Mincho. And, so you got some very different things that they were playing with at the time. So, yeah, I think it's reasonable to assume that they didn't know what they wanted to do. Maybe they got this opportunity. There were writers who were like, okay, we're going to write songs for you. This is what a girls rock band should do. And they kind of just went along with it and probably enjoyed it. But obviously after a couple of releases, they started to, wonder whether it was ever going to explode. And then of course, Thrill came along and that's when they really burst out. But yeah, this is very much a look into an earlier time. So anyway, you guys, first of all, had you heard this album before we agreed that we were going to talk about this today? And whether you did or didn't, what did you think of it?
Should I go first?
Yeah, go on. You take this one first, mate.
So I have heard of this album before. It wasn't my first Band-Maid album. It didn't start at the beginning. Actually, I think it was my last album that I heard from Band-Maid, the very last. But it wasn't an album I necessarily came back to listen to since I heard it then. But I have to say I really enjoyed this re-listen a lot. It's not necessarily, like, to sum up my thoughts, it's not necessarily what I usually come to for Band-Maid. It's a little bit too tame for my personal taste. But I would say it's a great like pop rock album.
I think you
That's
probably echo
yeah.
what a lot of people I've heard would probably say about it as well.
I think all these songs
You know,
are really great and enjoyable. So yeah, don't really have any critique about it other than I like the more newer Band-Maid sound more.
Yeah, I'm 100% in the same ballpark with Benedict on this one. It is probably like, without a shadow of a doubt, probably my least favorite album that they've done. It's kind of hard. Like with some bands, when you first discover them, you can go back to listen to their earlier stuff and you can kind of still vibe off it. For me, I like I said, I kind of like entered the equation like Howard said around that Thrill time, and that kind of got swept up in that as they were just kind of like becoming a little bit bigger. A little bit before that, but around about that time, same time frame. And like I'll be honest, kind of coming back to this one, knowing what they do now, it's a bit of a hard listen for me personally. Like it's not necessarily bad. I don't personally think it's still a really good album. It's just it sounds a little bit like a completely different band compared
A
to
little
like
bit, yes.
World Domination or something like that. Like you put those side by side, I'm just kind of like, wow, this is the same band, really. And again, that probably echoes what I think it was Benedict that said it again.
Yeah.
Maybe the girls don't know what they were doing, and maybe it was a label. I mean, there's definitely parts of this album where you can hear the girls that you hear now. There's definitely like chord progressions and the way the songs are written and structured that you're like, oh yeah, that is Band-Maid still. But it is still very hampered down by I think many things. A lot of power chords here, a lot of strict chords, less technical. The pace obviously is a lot more slowed down for various reasons. And it's funny how it said, it came out this probably around the same time as Baby Metal debut album as well, because this album probably was created going off what came before it, like the sound of Japan around that time, I imagine, which probably, as we've said in the last video, Baby Metal kind of opened the floodgates for more experimentation when it came to hard rock and metal, I feel.
Mm.
So, like, if they're basing it off like the 5 years prior before this 2014 album came out, they would obviously try to recreate, the main thing that's going on then. And I feel like it took them a couple of years after that to go, okay, let's do us now. Let's do our own unique sound, which sounds distinctly Band-Maid. That's what I love about it though, because if you put Band-Maid on, like you instantly, it's like you're like, oh, that's Band-Maid, because Band-Maid have their own sound, and it just feels like in this album, it's there, but it's
Yeah.
like it's very slight. It just feels like a band that's come together,
I do really agree
recorded.
with that point. I would have described it as that this first album has a little bit less of their identity, or like it's less coherent overall, feels more like just a compilation of a couple of great songs,
Hmm.
but not, as coherent as something like Conqueror or something later on.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe a more interesting comparison would maybe be to compare it to like New Beginning and Brand New Made, because obviously those are the two albums that followed, which again, I mean, Brand New Made less so, but those are two albums which again had a large amount of writing from staff writers, if you like.
Yeah.
These were albums again before Bandmate had fully taken over, but they obviously showed a change in the sound of the band. So I wonder, like, obviously it's very different from what they do now, but do you feel like it was quite different from the two albums that followed? Because that for me was the interesting part of their progression going into those two following albums. And I should just, by the way, I just want to point out to your earlier point, I did just check, and apparently the Babe Metal and the Bandmate debut came out within like just about one calendar month of each other.
Jesus
They were
Christ.
right next to each other. So yeah.
That's actually really
Like
surprising.
the other one from Baby Metal and Judgment Day from Love Bites, which also
Mm.
came out in like 1 month. It's two of my absolute favorite albums.
We're treated with it.
Good times for music, I guess.
It was. It was. Yeah.
Hmm.
It just feels like an album which is. I'm not going to say rushed, but like Benedict says, kind of lacks a little bit of identity. Although it's really weird because I feel like we're being overly harsh on it because we know what comes after. Like we
Yeah.
we know
Well,
we
this
know
is
what we
why
got now.
But
So
this
we're.
is why I think it's
Hmm,
more interesting to maybe compare it to like Brand New Made, an album
hmm.
like that. So I wonder how you'd compare it to Brand New Made and New Beginning
But
more than what they
I
do
feel
now.
like the most noticeable change is after the first three albums.
Well,
That's
yeah, because
really
that's when
where I
they started
notice a
writing.
great change. I
That's
still
when they.
feel like the two that come after the initial release, they are a bit better in that aspect. They feel a bit more, yeah, like they go in a direction rather than just compile
Right.
some
Okay.
songs. But I still feel it's not as, yeah, it doesn't reach the height of their original stuff.
Yeah,
See,
I agree. I feel like the change to the next two albums there was definitely like a more of a sense of a direction. Like they all kind of knew what they were going to do. There was definitely like more hints of the sound that we know now in those two albums. This one sounds a little bit. I'm going to get so much shit for this. But this sounds like Band-Maid trying to be like Scandal rather than Band-Maid trying to be Band-Maid in this album a little bit. To me. Um, that's how to me it kind of comes across a bit.
That's what I would
there
call
was
tame, the
there was a
tameness.
I can really tell I'm speaking to two metalheads here, can't I?
Yes,
Um,
that's very true.
so
Yeah, there's
I
that
mean,
as well.
personally, I mean, the reason I say this is because you mentioned, and there's a few points you brought up there, so I kind of feel like I want to just sort of dive in on a few points if you don't mind. First of all, you mentioned about the album feeling less like an album and more like a mishmash of ideas kind
But
of
just
coming
compared
together.
to the other albums.
Well, this is interesting because that's one of the reasons why, to be honest, my least favorite Band-Maid album is probably Brand New Made, which is interesting because it's a very pivotal album. But for me, whereas we had Just Bring It felt really like, okay, everything's in full gear now. Brand New Made, I felt like it was in this period where you could tell there was this conflict between the old Band-Maid and the new Band-Maid. And as a result, the album to me feels much more, it doesn't feel
Band-Maid
cohesive. It's
was
got
the
great
second one,
songs.
right?
No, so Brand New Made was the
Third one.
third album,
Yeah.
just before Just Bring It, which is when they really took over, and
Yeah.
Just Bring It being the first full length album, I think you probably argue. But yeah, for me, like with Brand New Made, just looking through the list of tracks here now, it's like I remember it's probably the album I go back and listen to cover the least because I feel it's very inconsistent. It's got some great tracks on there, but it doesn't feel like an album to me. Whereas the interesting thing is that Made in Japan, actually, to me, for whether you like it or not, I'm intrigued by that particular comment because I feel it feels like a very cohesive album. It doesn't feel like Band-Maid as we know them. There are certain little hints of it, like on "By My Tears" has like a really very Psyche-esque kind of melody as we kind of know her more now. And the last couple of tracks as well, you get to hear Psyche singing a little bit more in the way that she does these days. But it does feel to me like a very cohesive album. So I'm kind of intrigued that you didn't feel that as much.
Well, there are some songs on it. For example, the first, I don't know, the Japanese titled one, song number 7.
Is that
Um,
before dawn?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure it just has 4 Japanese characters.
Yeah, I mean before
It's got the
dawn.
kanji for dawn and the kanji for
Yeah.
before. So yes, I'm going to call that before.
Okay,
Yeah, but
that's probably
I was going to say
that
before
one.
dawn and forward on that album, my two favorite songs back to
I
back.
really like that song as well, but I feel like it doesn't really fit on that album super well. It's like more a bit more of an experiment, which I think it's a great song, but yeah, that one threw me out a little bit. And also, yeah, I don't know. Key has a little hint of some heavier sides that which we don't get again in the album. So yeah, that's kind of why I thought that way.
I'm a little bit the opposite. Like I just said, I really enjoyed Before Dawn and Forward
I
for
really
me.
enjoy it as well. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah,
for
I think
Forward, for
Benedict was saying the
example,
same
I
thing.
think one of my favorite Bandmate tracks
Hmm.
overall,
I
probably.
actually really prefer the back end of this album more than I enjoyed the
Yeah,
probably the
but
main line.
song number 7, the Before Dawn, it has that weird, I don't know, a bit of Latin flavor, a bit of a different vibe to it.
I love the opening to that song though. It's so different.
Yeah, it's great.
So uh
Just wanted to say why I felt it's not as a coherent album as some of the others, because I
It's
feel
interesting
that
because
song
I
is a
feel like
bit.
those two songs progress in a direct. So the album progresses in a direction towards the end. It doesn't feel to me like a jarring change. It's more like it just feels like it progresses into a
And not
slightly
really
different direction
jarring, but
towards the
not
end.
really as fitting, I would say.
I mean, going back to Howard's original point, I think where he compares it to Brand New Made, like even though I agree with Howard, in a way because I do feel like this album sort of like is more coherent and flows a little bit better.
Or we have to listen
Um,
to Brand New Made again.
but with Brand New Made, even though it's less coherent and there's definitely more stylistic choices going on in that album as a whole, and different ideas being thrown around. I feel like there's like loads of hits, even though there's a few L's.
Yeah,
But with this album, I like originally like there's a lot more L's and W's for me. which, I am kind of thankful that I became a fan a few years later, like later down the line, because I'll be honest, if I heard this album and somebody said, "Oh, Band-Maid, they're absolutely amazing," and they introduced me with this album, I don't know if I would be like
Actually
as
wanted to ask you that. Okay.
yeah, I don't know if I would vibe off them as much as I do now, knowing later on what happens.
Yeah, I
Th
think
this
it's
is
the same for me.
I got to ask though, because I mean, like, I would assume that a song like "Rockin' Me" would be one that you'd kind of enjoy, and yet "Rockin' Me" very much feels like it could have just been pulled straight off of this album, with maybe exceptions to like the way it's mixed and produced. It basically "Rockin' Me" feels very much like it could be on this album stylistically, and I think that's where the context things comes in a lot because I think "Rockin' Me" people look at it a very different way because they see it as the more bright, silly Miku song on that album that gives it a little bit of levity. Whereas when you give them an album that mainly probably is more levity than rock, then perhaps it recontextualize everything in a negative, well, not a negative way, but it maybe makes people a little bit more like, oh, I'm not sure I'm enjoying this. Whereas if you just come off the back of world domination and then you got
yeah.
Rockin'
I
Me, you're like,
Yeah, I mean, going back to the point I made before, I think the difference with like some of their newer stuff is like when they play that, that's like distinctly Band-Maid, and
yeah,
like nobody does it better than Band-Maid in those albums for me. Like you can't go anywhere else if you want to experience that. But with this
Yeah.
album, like kind of going back to what I said before with the Scandal comparison, with this type of album, with this type of music that they released with the first album, I could argue that there's better bands in this period, like I said, like Scandal, that would do it better. You know,
At least there are other
at
groups who
least there.
provide the same thing,
Yeah.
kind of.
So there's more conversation. So like there's less of a Band-Maid identity, although there is like
yeah.
traces of it there still.
I think although there's less of a Band-Maid identity, I would still say that I do think it might not sound like Band-Maid in the way that we know them now, but I certainly don't feel like it feels too much like it is too similar to any of the kind of more poppy rock bands that were around at the same time. I mean, like you say, there is a certain Scandal comparison, yet it certainly doesn't sound like Scandal. I mean, it sounds like Scandal adjacent more than modern Band-Maid adjacent.
Mm.
But I mean, you absolutely wouldn't like say, oh well, I don't need to listen to this because I've got Scandal, because I feel like they are enough very clear stylistic differences for me at least. I would say though that you made an interesting point earlier, Neon, that I kind of maybe wanted to come back to because you made a really interesting point about the context at the time. And we were talking earlier about how they were trying to find out what they wanted it to be, but as you say, at the time we were kind of in a world where Japanese music had gone overseas, but not in anything like the way it had post Babe Metal debut, and obviously you had Kyari Pami Pami like just before that as well, which I keep on pointing out that had a massive effect, and Gangnam Style from Korea like launching the whole K-pop thing. Asia was really blowing up at that time, and there wasn't a clear scene as much. So the bands that they probably would have seen that were doing well would have been the more standard girls rock bands, like as you mentioned, Scandal would have probably been one of them, amongst others. I mean, the sort of Stereo Ponies of this world, even Zone. There was plenty of pop rock which was coming out at the time. I still feel in a way like they had a heavier edge than those bands. So even with this album, you can feel like they're going for they're veering towards heavy even quite early on.
Yeah, it's definitely there. It definitely sounds more like someone's got a pillow over their face and muffling them a little bit. But they're trying to scream, but they just can't quite get it out. It's there,
I'm
but
not sure I agree with that, but
no. Ooh la la.
It's like you've agreed with me, but also worded it in the way that makes me most uncomfortable.
Brace yourself. That's what I'll be doing to you when I'm in Japan. But yeah, again, it's
Let's think
there.
of separate rooms, Howard.
There isn't one. It's not like you with your brand new house. I don't have like a special dungeon where I can keep people.
Well,
Howard's
sure.
the But yeah, like I said, it's definitely there. The creativity is there. Everything is there, and it's still a really good album. It's so hard looking at this one a little bit though, without the blinkers on. Like I'm trying to look at it like objectively, like trying to take away what we've got now to like really listen to that album again. And still, I still enjoy it, but I still don't think it quite reaches the heights of like everything they released later. But there is potential here, and I just think that's what this album is. It's just a band that probably just formed, just rushed, don't quite know what they're doing yet. Again, we've already said this is going to be studio interference or them wanting to go in a certain direction to make the money, pushing them to do certain things they maybe perhaps didn't want to do with songwriting and stuff like that they didn't have total control over.
I don't, again, I don't know that I'm really willing to subscribe to that. I think it's
Although
possible, but then
to be fair, sorry,
like
Band-Maid weren't too big back then. So the studio might not have tried to push them as much. Just maybe.
It's not like they'd suddenly been signed to like Universal, and Universal were like, we're going to make you the next big thing, fall in line. I think they were still, even with the financing they had, they were still a very small thing that was more dabbling with, and I think they would have been in that position where it was more a case of I think the company would have been just like, okay, let's find out what works. And obviously at the time, the band might not have had much input on what they wanted to be either. I also think as well that with debut albums, they can go many different ways. You can get some debut albums where they kind of snap together very quickly. But I think a lot of the time, debut albums are actually something which people put a lot of time into because there's no real pressure. There's no one looking over your shoulder so much. It's like, okay, we're going to do this. And then you kind of work it out. You put out an album with a few songs. I suspect this is probably more. In my head, I imagine this less as being a rushed out debut where the company pushing it, and I imagine it more as a sort of like a slightly procrastinated thing where they were like, "Oh, let's try this. Oh, let's try this song," and the company's like, "Oh, I think you'd be good with this." And I more imagine a sort of a procrastinating, sort of umming and ahhing mental image of this than a churned out debut with a predetermined image slapped on it.
Underline my point about it not being as cohesive as the other albums because they were just take this song and take this song and this is great.
I know what you mean.
Instead of a group saying we will write this album in this style and have this kind of vibe about it.
No, but I don't mean that when I say sort of procrastinating, I don't mean that as in the album was sort of disjointed and lots of decisions didn't work together. I just mean like each decision probably was taken a little bit at a time. And I imagine they probably did take time, put it together. There was probably a lot of consultation. This is probably something that everyone thought, yeah, that's the way we wanted it to be. And then afterwards, like I say, maybe they, that's often the case, you create something and you look back at it afterwards and go, well, maybe that isn't what we want to be. I do still feel if to me it feels like a relatively cohesive album. I'll be honest. I still feel.
I want to know your opinion on it more than anything. Obviously, me and Benedict have spoken at it coming from a completely different direction. Like you said, coming as like metalheads, obviously preferring the faster, more frantic nature of Band-Maid. Like for you being more the opposite direction, the odd one out, the black sheep of the family, shall we say? What does the album kind of mean to you a little bit? Like kind of looking back on it. Do you see the same things we do, or is it?
I really want to know as well because I think that's a strong difference.
Yeah,
because after listening to this album, I was like, yeah, this is really nice, and then I was like, just to compare, let's listen to some stuff from World Domination. I was like, whoa, this is so much more my style.
Yeah, I mean, there's some points where I agree with you where it's kind of almost undeniable. Like you can tell that. I mean, apart from anything, the albums where they didn't have like full writing control yet, they're always going to be less identifiably Band-Maid because they're not going to have the things that we associate, which very much comes from the writing. Also, the fact that playing style wise, they were all a bit more junior, Mika especially, obviously. So, a lot of the musicianship that we
have to say, like Misa, for example, looking at Neon's name, Misa going off from the very first track.
But she's obviously like all of them, Misa, Akane, they all show signs of brilliance on here, but they've come a long way subsequently. Yeah. I would say though, for me, the interesting, because obviously I think we all agree on that because that's kind of like an undeniable contextual thing that it's always going to be the case that it's not like this was a direction choice on its own. This was something from an earlier time. Direction wise though, I do really enjoy listening to it because of the fact that for me, it's like hearing a band who I like, but 99% of it, well, 90% of the time, Band-Maid are doing hard rock, hard rock, hard rock. And I love that. That's who they are. They found that themselves. But in the same way that I love when they do something like Page, when they do About Us, when they do Memorable, when they flex their ability to do variation. For me, like being able to go back and go, I'm going to listen to a pop rock song by Band-Maid. This is one of the reasons why I brought up Rockin' Me, because that's kind of the same vibe I get when I listen to Rockin' Me. It's kind of like, this is so surreal, except here it's those pop rock songs, but rather than being dished out to Miku, we've got pop rock kind of songs, but with Psyche on. I mean, that opening track, Be Okay, that is one of those songs I will always come back to, that because it's got a big catchy chorus. It's not very Band-Maid in so many ways, but it is actually being played by Band-Maid, and it is being sung in Psyche's voice. And I find that very, very interesting, sort of surreal, but very interesting.
It's an uncanny valley kind of thing, isn't it? Like, it's Band-Maid, but it's much like, oh, what is this?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because it's a little bit of the feeling I got, that all of the songs kind of feel a bit like a Miku song, but not really.
Yes. Yeah. Well, this is where I feel like sense. maybe this album, because obviously Miku is the one who brought them together, maybe a lot of the reason why this album sounds like this is because this would maybe have been Miku's default sound. Yeah. Hence why the songs that she sings later, they tend to, Time, Rockin' Me, they tend to feel more like they would have been comfortable on this album, because I think this is maybe the default sound that she's more used to. I mean, this album, you could argue, sounds nearer to Clupo than to Mortal. That would be an arguable one, but it's possible. Yeah, I mean, you could argue that. Yeah. I would say though, the one thing and I think Benedict brought this up as well. The one thing that always surprises me when I go back to it, because this album doesn't fit in a very easy place. It's more of an oddity. But every time I go back to it, I am always surprised just how much I enjoy it. And this is even as someone who's more likely to like it than, as you mentioned yourselves. Every time I go back to it, I'm just like, this is a really good, fun album. It's really enjoyable. So I think that
I thought the same. It's just that I like the other stuff even more.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. I think that dissonance is maybe
our critique is on a very high level here.
Yeah, it's maybe a different level of difference for me, but I mean, obviously, what they do now is much more.
Yeah, that's one of the good things about Band-Maid, though, is that evolution over time. We've seen and heard them develop over so many years now. It's going backwards sometimes is a bit like, oh, we know how good we got it now. I know people will have different opinions with that one, because some people like their older stuff a little bit more. But it's like you got it so good now. It's like looking back at your ex and going, "Oh, what was I thinking?"
But when everyone has when everyone has a different period in a band's history that they like most, which seems to be the case with Band-Maid, at least that shows that the band's staying dynamic and they're not just sitting still.
Yeah.
I mean, when you've got bands where everyone's like, oh, I like every single album, and they always stay true to themselves, that often is like shorthand for this band doesn't have any fucking variation. Yeah. It's like this band has no ambition to do anything but keep on copy pasting the same thing. Whereas when you've got a band where people can really argue about, well, I prefer this album, I prefer that album, it's like, well, this band is probably innovating then. They probably stand on their toes.
I get that you like New Beginning and Brand New Maid the least, probably, out of all the albums then.
I would say it's a bit of a tricky one for me, because if I am an album listener. I like albums.
Yes.
So, I could pick individual songs off of Brand New Maid and just say, I absolutely love that song. I mean, Brand New Road, ironically, being one of them. But, when it comes to Brand New Maid, as an album, for me, it feels conflicted. You can tell that there's this underlying, again, none of us know for a fact everything going on in the background, but obviously there was a lot of changing of the hands, experimenting going on there. And that might have been a gleeful kind of experimentation, but it ended up with this kind of Frankenstein's monster of an album that just feels very, like, it doesn't make a great listen for me. Despite having great songs on it. Whereas obviously when you look at the first two albums, you've got New Beginning and you've got Maid in Japan. For me, those are two albums that feel nice, they feel cohesive. Obviously everything from Just Bring It onwards, that's like a whole new band. That's Band-Maid are now Band-Maid, they hit the ground running. Would
you say that's like the general consensus of Band-Maid fans? I mean, obviously some people will like the first album the most or something, but I feel like that's the general consensus of Band-Maid fans. Like the first three albums, they are good for what they are, but afterwards it's better.
I feel like most fans, I think the general consensus is probably Made in Japan is the lowest one because it's not rock enough. Then the next two albums are like, thrill and post-thrill era, everything's getting better. And then after, the funny thing is we're not going to do it now, but I was going to say at some point in the future, I would love to do a video where we talk about Just Bring It, because obviously that was the pivotal album where everything changed in regards to their writing. So if people in the comments want us to, we might come back and talk about that in the future. But yeah, I think as a general, that's probably how most people rank it. And then everything from Just Bring It onwards is just dependent usually on when someone joined as a Band-Maid fan, because they'll usually join through the album that brought them in, and that will be the Band-Maid they like. And then when Band-Maid goes and innovates afterwards, that tends to shake people off. It's like, wait a second, they don't do the same thing on every album.
Yeah, it's probably another change with World, what's it called? The finger
Domination.
one.
Unseen World.
Unseen World, yeah.
I've just realised they got World in the name of 2 album titles.
Yeah.
Never noticed that before. Anyway, don't know if that's
next album. Reveal Pigeon World.
World of Po.
World of Po, yeah. I can't believe how fast we like. I'm just looking at the free version of Zoom. Why not Ruby?
Yeah.
Time, by the way, it's just popped up with like 10 minutes left to go. I can't believe how incredibly fast that half an hour of us talking about this album has gone. That is a testament to band, like how.
Can I therefore throw in a quick curveball just for the last few minutes, because this is something that Benedict mentioned towards the beginning. I think actually he might have mentioned this before we press record, so apologies if this didn't come up. Because we briefly talked about the fact that Neki had a new song come out, and I'm not specifically talking about that song right now, but I really loved it. And a lot of people went to Neki because they were kind of, again, Band-Maid adjacent. They'd started off doing a couple of Band-Maid covers, and as Neki have released new songs, I've noticed people kind of saying more and more like, they're not going in the direction I like. They're moving a little bit more pop rock. And I kind of feel like it's interesting that, because obviously Neki have absolutely no duty to do what Band-Maid does. They're their own band. I feel like they're finding their identity and it's taking them in the opposite direction. And for me, this is the really cool thing, is I feel like we're seeing Neki kind of doing a reverse Band-Maid, in that they're starting off a little bit heavier. And as they're getting more inclined to enjoy what they do, they seem to be moving towards slightly more Made in Japan style songs, but with their skills increasing and increasing. And yes, I know they still do have certain degrees of writer input, but they also work very heavily on their own songs. They do a lot of writing on their own music as well. So it's kind of like more like guided writing with them. But I feel like they're doing a reverse Band-Maid. They're maturing, but they're maturing towards maybe a more poppy sound.
Kind of, but I have to say, you didn't want to get into the song, but I have to. The new song Dreams, especially after listening to this album, I felt like it really feels kind of like it could fit on this album, the new song. Really awesome pop rock stuff. And I feel even more pop rock or pop punk, however you want to describe it, than their earlier releases, talking about Neki. So yeah, I kind of agree with that sentiment. I'm not sure if they will stay in that direction. They could go the other way still, but
still very early days.
Yeah, I think that's probably my favorite Neki track, so I'm kind of happy about that development, actually, because to me that feels like it feels, I don't know, it feels more, I don't know, more something that fits them than what they did before.
They feel very comfortable, don't I mean, for me, I hear them doing this and they just sound very comfortable. I mean, I think Reagan Girl might still be my favorite song by them, but this is kind of like, this is like right alongside there. And yeah, I think that they're a band who are definitely doing that. But it's interesting because they feel like they're kind of growing into their own sound as they become more Made in Japan. Whilst Band-Maid, I feel, had to find their own sound by becoming less Made in Japan and more just rocking Made in Japan.
Yeah.
Do you know what I would love? I know this will never happen, but like I don't think I've ever known like a band to like properly go back and like remaster or rework an album. But I would love Band-Maid to re-release like Made in Japan, but all the same songs, but redo it like with all the knowledge, experience, know-how, and the sound they have now, and see how that translates, and see if they can make like this album like feel a little bit different.
I would love them to redo it with their current skill set, but I wouldn't
Mm.
want them to just make it the current sound. Because if it
Mm.
was a heavier version of Made in Japan, it wouldn't be Made in Japan anymore. I think you'd have
Yeah.
to do it without making
Not
it
sure
heavier,
how.
but maybe add some little flourishes, add a little bit of
Yeah.
their writing prowess to it rather than changing the
Get-
tone of the album.
Get some
Yeah, I
more
think you
lead
have to be
licks.
careful about how you change that, how you change it up, because if you just make it the new style, it wouldn't be the same thing anymore. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Not sure how
You don't
well
want
it
to
would
Ryan
work.
Johnson it. Don't Ryan Johnson.
You never want to Ryan Johnson.
We've got to bring him up. We've got to bring him up regularly.
Jesus
Don't Ryan
Christ.
Johnson it.
Again, as soon as we hit 1,000 subscribers, I'm making that t-shirt. Ryan Johnson it.
Oh man.
Yeah, so I mean, in short, when it comes to Made in Japan, this is definitely an album that I would go back to and listen to. But I think its biggest difficulty is it doesn't feel like, as much as I like it, I think the reason why most people don't go back to it so much is because it kind of just doesn't feel like it belongs anywhere. It does feel like, whereas Brand New Made, these albums do definitely, the subsequent
just
albums
to me,
definitely do feel like they still at least are Band-Maid albums.
When I want to
Made
listen
in
to a
Japan.
Band-Maid album, I'm looking like, or something from this.
It feels
Just why not choose something from there?
Exactly. I think this album, I don't think it's aged well. Like one of those movies you used to love as a kid that doesn't, you look back at it and you go, holy fuck, that's old. I just think that album and the way that it was created, it just like kind of highlights like the error of that time, which is really weird to say because 2014 is not that long ago, realistically. But in terms of the sound,
10 years is 10 years.
Well, yeah, it's still 10 years.
I feel like if that album came out now, it would still do really well. I think the only reason it has aged is because of the fact that if it's aged in the context of being a Band-Maid album, yeah. If it was just like, if that was debuting as a brand new album by a brand new band, yes, it's not quite the most cutting edge sounding recording, but I think it'd still do really well today. As like, what's this band? We need to keep an eye on them. I think.
Yeah, I think
because again, it sounds a bit like
well
Necky, doesn't it? And they're
if
doing
you
well.
know the rest of Band-Maid.
Yeah.
It didn't age well if you know the rest of Band-Maid. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So, I mean, yeah.
But it's hard to tell as someone who knows Band-Maid.
Well, that's it. You know what comes afterwards. It's hard to switch that out of your mind. Try and look at this like contextually as just like a soul album sometimes because there's always that thought in the back of your head. But I know what they do next. I feel like,
I mean, I kind of agree. If they would release like this as the next album or something like this, then I think a lot of people would be disappointed in just the sound of it.
Man, if they release something like that with their current
themselves.
playing skill, I would be really kind of excited. Just something like that, but with their current flourishes.
Here's a quick one then. I know we haven't got much time, but we were talking about obviously being hankered into something heavy and then going softer with Necky. Do you feel like Band-Maid now have built them up so much with the progress that maybe they're being like shoehorned and have to stay in their genre of being a little bit heavier? Do you think they'll ever go back to a softer sound, or do you think they'll stay in that ballpark? Yeah, or do you reckon they'll stay in that ballpark?
All right. So basically, I think there is a certain degree by which they maybe don't do the lighter stuff because they feel maybe their fans don't want it, which is why often you don't hear it on the albums. Things like Start Over and About Us, they appear as non-album tracks a lot of the time for exactly that reason. But I do still think that one of the things that makes Band-Maid so great and stand out from the rest of the competition is the fact that they are willing to do these deviations and show that they can do lighter sounds as well. And that's one of the reasons why I love them so much. They have that variation. They have the ability to go back to that sound. They just choose to keep their fans happy as well, and they like being heavy. So anyway, remember to keep your ears to the east. We got 15
I have no idea if
seconds,
my countdown was correct.
we got 10 seconds now. 10.
Okay.
7.
I think they should stay heavy, but heavy can be a lot of things.
Time to spare.
Oh, this didn't